Special thanks to my Patreon patrons, Noble Tier and Larking Tier. Hey guys, it's Michael and I'm back for another reaction video, and today we're back with Wendigoon's Conspiracy Theory Iceberg. We are on the last two videos essentially, so this will be the second to last video of his tier list for this iceberg. So yeah, let's get straight into it. To be honest, I do not remember what was in the last tier. Okay. I remember now. I just had to get a little glimpse. So yeah, let's get straight into it.
Holistic tubes is a specific kind of alternative medicine, specifically a type of alternative medicine that relies on charged metals. Whenever most people think of alt medicine, they think of things like herbal remedies or
acupuncture
stretching and meditation. Well, this would be like alt medicine. The idea behind holistic tubes is that the majority of sicknesses or illnesses that people encounter come from a place of negative energy. A lot of this goes back to things I've talked about earlier, like spiritual chakras or energy gathering beings and things like that. While there are different theories on how these tubes are charged, a majority of them say something like magnetized tubes or potentially energy charged tubes, such as a sort of battery. A lot of these I saw had to do with ear infections, so the idea that you could take a metal rod, magnetize it, put it in your ear, and get pain relief. If this were to be true, it would obviously lead to more revelations in science, such as ideas of how energy is determined and what illness truly is. But that belief has several practitioners and users.
So, pace yourself. No, not really.
Users to this day. Cuneiform language and technology is relating back to the idea of cuneiform language,
which is
never
seen this before.
Old world written language that relied more on symbols and logos rather than pronunciation and words as we know today. You can think of this as things like old Mesopotamian text or things like Egyptian hieroglyphics. Now, while there is a specific type of programming language referred to as cuneiform because it uses symbols very similar to that of cuneiforms, the greater theory behind it comes back to ideas of relearned intelligence. Or in other words, people thousands and thousands of years ago decided the best form of writing was that through symbols and logos, and then sure enough in modern technology there seems to be examples of people relearning what was once known. Now, while the theory partially ends there and it's just the idea that people continuously relearn whatever the highest order of information is, we can have more fun with it and apply that back into the Great Reset theory, or the idea that humanity works in cycles on the same planet Earth. If that were true, then perhaps the ancient people who wrote the first cuneiforms got their inspiration from the remnants that were left behind by what we would consider a modern society, and then that modern society got it from the previous group of old-time people, and so on and so forth. Essentially creating an almost paradox of information that is passed on from yourself within the previous cycle. Bhutanese shadow market refers to the landlocked country that resides between India and China in the East Himalayas, known as Bhutan. Now, initially, ideas around the Bhutanese shadow market, as it was referred to online, was pretty much your standard ideas of a sort of black market organ trade. And while that would normally be as deep as the theory goes, we're on tier 9, so you know it gets worse. According to those who have interacted with the shadow market, it is not a physical or in-person trade as we would know it, but instead a spiritual storefront. In other words, the only way to access anybody in the shadow market is through meditation and contacting them within a spiritual realm. From there, this supposed shadow market that is
the thing that's so cool about a lot of these conspiracies is literally someone could make a lot of these out of a movie. So they could make a movie out of this. Like, this would be so cool. Like, the only way you can get to a specific market is to enter into a meditative state. This would be a cool movie.
Operated by Bhutanese monks, sells a plethora of forbidden or sacred spiritual goods. And supposedly these goods that they sell are spiritual items such as the life elixir, which can make someone be immortal, human souls trapped within jars, and things like curses in bottles. So essentially, if one reads a high enough plane of understanding but wants to have their hands on nefarious items, they could use their plane of understanding to contact one of the monks within the Bhutanese shadow market and then buy things like human souls and magic capable items off of them. You know, sometimes I say stuff like that and then I think to myself, like, wouldn't it be funny if someone heard that out of context? But at this point in the iceberg, I think I'd just be committed. Hydrophobia experiments is essentially another name for rabies experiments. See, rabies was originally known as hydrophobia, at least back whenever Louis Pasteur was developing his vaccine for it.
Ooh,
The
I've
reason
never heard
for
of
this
that.
being creatures that were infected with rabies and showing symptoms of it had a strong aversion to water. The reason for this is the rabies
Oh,
virus
I have heard that where people do not want to drink any kind of water because of rabies, which make it's like the your body doesn't want it at all. And I also heard that only a few known people in the modern world have gotten over rabies. Uh, it's either gotten over it or gotten the shot. I can't remember. I think there was a few people who got not natural immunity, but they got over it naturally. And then I think in a poorer country, there were people who just naturally got over it, just in general.
causes such an intense swelling of salivary glands that it makes it hard to swallow. So if a subject tries to swallow water, they begin to choke and throw up. Ironically, the intense salivation and high body temperature makes the patient very, very thirsty, so it's a very tragic and slow way to die. However, as you probably know, rabies is most famous for the deranged nature that it gives to the people who are infected by it. Well, see, that's where these experiments come in. So rabies itself is a form of a single-strand RNA virus. Now, without getting into all the details of what that means, one of the things that it means is that it can mutate very, very easily. To put it in perspective, things like the common cold and the flu are also single-strand RNA viruses, and there's new versions of them several times a year. So the theory is, since this is not only a very scary but a very infectious and mutatable pathogen, there have been countries that have done experiments on rabies in order to make a sort of bioweapon. The reason it's referred to as hydrophobia experiments is because people infected by it, it's not exactly rabies anymore because it's been combined with the flu and syphilis and a bunch of other diseases in order to make this new disease. However, the commonality through all of them is that the patient still experiences hydrophobia, so the disease is just called hydrophobia. But you can absolutely think of it as a zombie plague because according to the theory, that's exactly what it does. There are supposed logs that exist from Russia within the 1980s and the Cold War in which Russia kind of had the idea that if anyone decided to destroy them, they would have a sort of dead man switch, that they could give a final middle finger and infect the world with this sort of zombie plague, or in this case, the hydrophobia experiment. Supposedly, the patients...
I could really see any, like, nuclear country that has nukes. I could see them, like, if they are ever on the cusp of being destroyed completely, I could see them having a dead man switch where they just flip it and all the nukes shoot. So, whew, that's some scary stuff.
Within these hydrophobia experiments weren't just out of their head and frothing at the mouth, but they were particularly violent at trying to kill not only each other but anyone else who was nearby after dying 2 to 3 weeks in from dehydration. There are even theories that say during the Iraqi conflict, one of the reasons that there was so much containment measures and countries like the US were so hesitant to leave is because there had been stolen samples of the hydrophobia virus throughout the Middle East. And that one of the reasons world governments were so shady about what their involvement in the Middle East was is because they didn't want to alert worldwide panic by saying we're looking for the zombie plague, which to be fair could be, kind of concerning. Phantom time was a theory proposed by Herbert Illig. Essentially, the main idea behind it is that our modern understanding of history since the death of Christ is largely made up, or at the very least, the timeline is. According to him, the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III and the Pope of the same time, Sylvester III, put together this sort of idea in order to justify their placement of power. According to the theory, they essentially added several hundred years to history, which conveniently placed them at the year of 1000 AD.
Oh, I think I've heard of this before. Because there's like some weird inconsistencies in the time period. But yeah, there's no way for us to technically know if history is correct. Because a lot of the times, they always say history is wrote by the winners, so you don't technically know if every part of history is correct. Because I imagine a lot of it could have been either made up or skewed in a different way. So I have heard of this slightly. I don't know the main basis. I just remember that their time part of that was a little wonky.
Without getting into the politics of it, there was this whole battle over who had the divine right to Europe, and it looked a lot better for Otto and the Pope if they were exactly 1,000 years since the death of Christ, because that made them sound really good according to prophecies that were given. However, this did things like make the entire Carolingian, and I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but the Carolingian period of history completely non-existent, as well as significant figures like Charlemagne would not exist. The idea being that Otto made these characters up within history books as a means of further justifying their placement in history. According to Heribert's theory, specifically the years of 614 AD to 911 AD were made up, or in other words, 297 years of history. His reasons for this are ideas like Gregorian calendar, as it's written, has these gaps in its understanding and seems it was kind of pushed as a means to follow this new narrative, as well as things like Isaac Newton doing the math on the history of eclipses and realizing there's about a 300-year gap in history of when these eclipses took place, and as well as archaeology, since it seems that nearly no large structures were constructed within that 300-year time span, which it would be really weird if no significant empires built anything for 300 years of time and seemingly no new roadways or conquests were made. Again, the idea being that as a means of justifying their placement as rulers over the Holy Roman Empire, these two characters shifted the course of history as we know it forever. Null compliance security is a theory that I've got to be careful with because all the people involved are still people who are running things and organizations, and I'm not going to go into details because I do not want to be unalived. Yeah, but to give the sort of vague on details version, in 1997 there was an experiment that took place within a Florida prison system. The idea behind this experiment, which took place between the works of several medical schools and drug companies, was to find a long-term sedation for very violent inmates. Supposedly in 1997, this group began giving these specific medications to very violent inmates who were serving life sentences, and after only 40 days, the subject suffered from a permanent sense of total compliance, which is a fancy doctor way of saying that they had their higher cognition and abilities completely stripped from them. This turned what was otherwise violent inmates into essentially vegetative people walking around without really any sense of cognition or understanding. Supposedly this went on for 10 years, and this was conducted on 845 inmates, most of which are still alive and existing within the justice system as sort of mentally ill patients to this day. So essentially the theory is saying that because they can't perform normal lobotomies to shut up people that they're not fond of, they've now found a way to perform chemical lobotomies. Phlogiston theory resurfacing is in reference to a very old world belief of the phlogiston theory. Essentially, the theory said that anything that had the ability to catch on fire and burn contained an element or particle known as phlogiston. The idea being, if you are a creature that is capable of combusting, so I imagine all of us, you are just filled with the particle known as phlogiston. And then after you combust and your, burnt remains are lying there on the floor, you have now been dephlogistoned. And some things in the natural world, such as water, contain zero phlogiston whatsoever. But as time went on, we learned that fire was essentially a reaction of energy and of supercharged particles and yada yada. However, in recent years, it has been discovered that instead of a different kind of element, there is instead a fourth state of matter known as plasma. So this theory is saying that since we discovered a new state of matter, which has the capability of being what fire itself is, maybe in the future we will discover that there is a sort of trace particle that fire itself uses as a propellant. And then that opens up a whole new door of research. Like if people are flammable because they got the phlogiston in them or whatever, can we take it out without, burning them first? Santiago interference relates to something known as the Santiago theory of cognition. It's a theory of how cognition and life works that was developed by a series of biologists in Santiago, Chile, hence the name. Essentially, this sort of combination between biology and philosophy came to the conclusion that life cannot exist without cognition, and cognition itself cannot exist without life. So if something has both cognition, it must have life, and if something has life, it must have cognition. And consciousness, as we understand it, or the ability to think and be upright and be aware, is more so just cognition, but on a spectrum. And furthermore, these researchers define cognition itself as the ability to react to one's environment. So to kind of lay out what that whole theory is for you, say we have us as people as we exist. We have cognition, or in other words, we have the ability to physically react or understand things that are happening around us. You're watching me talk right now, that information's coming through your ears, your brain is processing it, and you're able to understand the point I'm getting across through language. That is
Somewhat.
a form of cognition. You are observing things happening in your environment and able to adjust yourself, i.e. your thought pattern, because of it. Now let's take something else that we know to be alive, like a plant. Obviously, plants are alive, but you can't talk to a plant and make it understand you, at least
we don't know.
I think that was on the iceberg somewhere, actually.
Yeah,
anyway,
I think I remember that too.
We can't talk to plants. However, a plant absolutely does have the ability to react to its environment. Several plants will not only grow into the direction of sunlight, but they do things like reproduce, and some are able to shut off their waterways depending on if it's a dry or wet season. So even though that's
and some are able to eat bugs.
Not consciousness, as we understand it, according to this definition, that is a form of cognition. So you can think of consciousness as the spectrum, grass being on the low end, us being on the high end, but everything within it having some different form of cognition. So that's the Santiago theory of cognition. So what would Santiago interference be? Well, that relates back to a concept known as cognitive interference. You know how sometimes you'll be sitting there and then you'll just have a really inappropriate or wrong thought run through your head? Like you weren't even thinking about anything in general. You can just be driving your car on the road, and then for some reason a split shot shoots through your brain that tells you to swerve the car off the...
Oh yeah, it's such the worst thing. It's like you irrationally want to make a choice, and it's like, why am I doing this? Like there's no reason for me to do this. And it's not even like you're mad, there's nothing going on, you're just driving normal, and then they'll just be like, why don't you just turn your car? And it's like, no. Why is it like that? Or hey, why don't you jump or fall right here or something like that? There's always all these weird situations where you randomly, it goes through your head, you're just like, yeah, why don't I do this crazy thing that could hurt me really badly?
The road. This is a phenomenon known as cognitive interference. There's a lot of theories about why cognitive interference happens, but one of the more commonly accepted ones is that whenever you're not using your brain's cognitive function, it uses that free time as a time to sort of self-check itself. Or in other words, whenever you zone out, your brain has conversations with itself to confirm ideas that it's only suggested. Basically like this. You know, hopefully, that murder is a bad thing to do. However, you probably haven't sat down with yourself and thought like, murder bad, I don't like it. It's just something you generally understand.
Yeah.
So because of that, you can be sitting in Pizza Hut and just chilling out, kind of zoned out, your brain vibing. So then your brain's like, hey, well, I've got your attention for a second. Are you sure you don't want to kill that guy across from you? No? Okay, making sure. Just don't worry about it. Go back to your pizza. So if your brain uses free moments as a means of checking with itself what is both fears and considers evil, then what would potentially happen if someone had their entire cognitive senses removed? There are theories, although hopefully no experiments that have ever been performed,
it could be
what
bad.
would happen if someone had all of their sensory stimuli removed, or in other words, their sight, smell, taste, hearing, and touch. Theoretically, they would still maintain motor functions, but be trapped in this sort of shell in which they can't understand anything about their environment. So in this time of free total cognition, if we know the brain to give short spurts of evil and wrong whenever it has a chance, what happens if it can give really, really long spurts of it? And again, according to the Santiago theory of cognition, something cannot be alive without having cognition and understanding its environment. So in this state of between life and death, is that where a sort of purgatory resides, in which someone's mind gives them all these evil ideas and entraps them to within themselves? Santiago interference essentially asks the question, if something cannot be alive without being cognitive, then what is a living thing without that cognition? Elaine Moore Island is something that I covered in great detail in my Ocean Mysteries video, link in the description. But to give a short version here, in the year 1900, there were 3 lighthouse cubes
Oh yeah, just to let y'all know, I will after this conspiracy theory. I probably said this like 3 or 4 times through the videos I've done on this iceberg, but I'm gonna say it again just so people know if they've somehow skipped a iceberg just to see me react to a certain specific part of it. But I will be doing other videos of his. I just, I'm trying my best to get through this one. I'm so close. I'm just one more video after this one and we'll be completely done with the iceberg. And then we can move on to some of the shorter videos that are like maybe an hour or so long, not a 9 hour and 30-minute video.
Keepers who were set to run the Elaine Moore Island lighthouse. However, while they were there, a heavy fog set in around the lighthouse. So heavy, in fact, the relief keepers were stalled a week from sailing out to the island. By the time they did eventually get there, the entire 3-man crew was missing. And by missing, I mean they totally vanished. There was still food set out on their table, all of the doors were shut, the beds were unmade. It's like they were going about their daily lives and just disappeared. However, what's most interesting about the story is the second mate's logbook of what events
I've heard this from somewhere. I can't remember where, but I've definitely heard this.
Had occurred. In the logbook, he said that they experienced storms.
Yeah, it was like storms.
So turbulent and powerful.
Yeah, and I think it was like, and there people on land didn't see any storms at all, but the logbook indicated that there was huge storms.
That it caused these 3 lifelong sailors to come together and pray and cry. Before the final entry simply said, "Storm has stopped, God is over all," and then again, they were never seen. Now, what's interesting is Elaine Moore isn't far from the shores of mainland Scotland, and there were no storms reported within that time period. As a matter of fact, ships were going about their daily schedule. So these supposedly very centered storms that didn't affect anyone outside of them and the heavy fog on the area has led theorists to believe that perhaps the Elaine Moore Island lighthouse crew was experiencing a sort of dimensional rift. Or if things like dimensions can be torn
that'd
into,
be cool.
Perhaps the fogs was a show of them crossing over or something crossing over into their realm. And even if unwanted, this complete vanishing of the Elaine Moore Island lighthouse crew could be a sign of dimensional travel, or a sort of short-term purgatory imposed on them for some reason. I should also mention that this entire story was the inspiration for the Robert Edgars movie The Lighthouse, so do with that information what you will. Sphinx water erosion hypothesis implications is an implication that
I think I've heard of this too.
Is way older than we believe it to be. See, the generally
I've heard this
version of history is that the Sphinx was built about 4,500 years ago.
How is it I'm in the late part of the iceberg and I'm knowing stuff? I swear from like probably about, I don't know, around either 5 or 6 all the way to around here, I didn't know but maybe 1 or 2 things max. But we're in this one tier here, and I've known 2 things so far at least. I may have known more than that. I can't remember. No, it was just the 2. But yeah, it's so weird. But I've heard this.
For this is the earliest dated time in which Egyptians settled the land, so it makes sense that the Sphinx was built around that time. However, there are 2 main hangups with that theory. For one, the Sphinx is very sand and wind eroded compared to structures around it. Like, sure, the pyramids aren't in perfect condition, but the Sphinx is to a point that the nose is completely missing, and it seems to have been there for a much longer time. The second and more damning fact is that in the pit around the Sphinx and within the Sphinx itself, there is a form of heavy water erosion. Or essentially, these lines that have ran through the stone are from some form of water that has poured over it. The issue with that being, that area of Egypt has not experienced significant rainfall to the point of causing any flooding in about 9,000 years. Because of this, that would mean that the Sphinx
was in Egypt was like a forest.
Believe it to be. And you may be asking, what's the big deal with that? Well, the Egyptians are one of the first recorded civilizations that existed at least outside of the immediate Middle East, or on the fringe of the Middle East, one of the first civilizations moving into Africa. So if they existed 4,500 years before when we believe them to have currently existed, that messes up all the timelines. That would give ideas like religion more footholds in how they describe humanity departing and settling regions. And essentially, if you were to add 4,500 years to modern society's clock, then a lot more could have happened and a lot more things make sense than current science and theories say they do. Archontic genetic engineered entities. Oh boy. So I talked about Archons way
This
back
sounds
in
crazy.
Iceberg, and I mentioned them as being essentially the demons within the religion of Gnosticism. And
Oh,
I'm not
yeah,
sure if
yeah,
you
I
know
remember
anyone
this.
who's like a
Yeah,
modern
yeah.
Gnostic, but just in case you're out there, I don't think they all believe in this. I think just a few of them. But I'm going to tell it anyway. So essentially the idea is there is a system within people called the gallbladder meridian. It starts in your ears and then connects in the middle of your brain and runs down your body and does some zigzags and eventually comes out on your fourth toe. The idea being this is the mainline control center
What?
for your body. So these
That sounds
archons
random.
with Gnosticism, these demons, have developed these parasites that essentially look like jellyfish that they implant in people through their ears. The jellyfish go to their gallbladder meridian and then start out slow by suggesting things to people like, hey, we should lay back on talking to family members and we should become more reserved. And it essentially starts as sort of a voice in your back of your head, but then it starts to control little tiny muscle movements and eventually gets to the point where it just takes over the human host. The purpose of this is for the Archons to one day develop a sort of zombie army through the use of these jellyfish parasites. And in reading this, there was a group of people known as the Star People who during the Orion Wars learned how to reach into someone's gallbladder meridian and pull out the demon parasite to keep them from being a part of the zombie army.
Proof?
I try to make jokes about some of it, but I just can't. We're moving on. Gnosticism be wild, and man, I'll tell you what. Ulfma is interesting. So I cannot find what the word Ulfma itself means. I believe it's an acronym since every letter is capitalized. However, if you search it on an alternate search site that isn't something like Google or Bing, you come to a search result for this book about Theosophy on the Amazon bookstore. The book was written by a man named Rudolf Steiner, who was one of the earliest proponents of Theosophy. Theosophy is essentially the idea that there is one hidden truth within the world, and once that one truth is understood, it can be manipulated. And furthermore, there is a group of these sort of reality hackers who have figured out what the one truth is, and they are known within Theosophy as the Masters. Supposedly, these Masters exist as prominent figures throughout history who have manipulated their place within history because they understand how the universe works. So they can perform things like magic and witchcraft and stuff that we would consider unexplainable, but it's actually all logical because they just understand how things go together. So that's the core idea of Theosophy itself. It's really interesting that whatever Ulfma means, it for some reason brings you to a book by one of their founders. And if you go through the book reviews on that book on the Amazon store, there are several people mentioning how Theosophy is so great and how they better now understand the root of the Masters and all this wild stuff. It's fantastic. Eggless travel refers to a theory that probably deserves its own video from the 1980s known as Ong's Hat. Ong's Hat is a sort of abandoned town in New Jersey that was supposedly the place for this conspiracy theory. This is one of the oldest online stories on the internet, starting all the way back in the 80s on internet bulletin boards. According to the stories, a group of Princeton professors had done enough experimentation with things like quantum mechanics to develop a way to perform a form of dimension travel, or in other words, teleportation and potentially time travel. They did this with something known as the egg, which was essentially a device that they described made them capable of moving through dimensions. However, there were theories within this that said if they got to a point where they no longer needed the egg to travel, they could seemingly just time and reality hop at will with no issues. So all those pictures you see that supposedly looks like someone wearing modern day clothes back in like the 1950s, or someone with a cell phone during like the Civil War, the idea behind it is that these Princeton professors eventually developed a form of eggless travel and are now simply just messing with the timeline and hopping around and causing problems wherever. So good for them. Prolepsis is a concept within literary works, and if someone is an English or literature major and wants to call me out for it, that's fine, but I promise I try. Essentially, prolepsis is describing an event or alluding to an event before the event itself actually happens. In literature, this is phrases like he was a dead man when he came through the door, which implies and tells us that that character is going to die. However, he's not dead yet, it's just alluding to it. So apply that concept to history and humanity. There are several instances of this quote-unquote foreshadowing existing in history. Everything from religions describing what nations would rise and fall and who would take over, to things like art that's only recently been discovered being very similar to modern art. Now, this implies one of two things. It implies that there are inevitable conclusions that every society will reach, or in other words...
Or just, you know, every once in a while people get really close and there's coincidences. Stuff like that happens.
It's like two separate experiments happening in two different points in time, and they each come to the same end result. Or you can have the really fun theory of the grand cycle that I love to talk about, and the idea that at some point someone started a trend, and then it's just constantly being relearned and rediscovered by every society afterwards. This creates a sort of chicken and egg paradox, because there's no way of telling where it would have began if that was the case, but it's wild to think that modern people inventing stuff that was inspired by ancient works was inspired by modern people the last time through the cycle. Stonehead of Guatemala is referencing this image that was taken in the 1950s within Guatemala.
Cool.
For whatever reason, in the middle of a completely uninhabited area of the Guatemalan jungle, there is this giant statue of a head. The artwork does not match any of local or known societies' artworks of what faces or statues looked like. And furthermore, after the researchers went back to their home country, there was this big political war that took place in Guatemala, and whenever they came back years later, they couldn't find where it was. And since that's all the information we have on it,
well, I can say right now it was probably covered up either by the jungle or someone destroyed it, one of the two. I would say it got covered up by the jungle because it already looks like it's almost covered up right now.
This is a giant that shot out of hollow earth, like it was down there, and it heard there were researchers, so it just like shot itself or a statue of itself out of the hollow earth, and then they took this picture, and then he thought it'd be really funny to hide it again. And that's what happened, and guess what? You can't prove me wrong, so we're just going to move on. The phone mafia is the idea that the majority of scam callers, as we know them to be, are actually part of a much larger and more grand body. Essentially, you know all those phone scams you get, things like the Nigerian prince, or the police saying you need to pay a speeding ticket, or cases saying that you have a relative who needs bailed out, etc.
Yeah.
Well, we understand those to each be just one-off callers trying to make a quick buck.
However, they definitely aren't.
There's a much larger crime syndicate who just works
through middleman
as a means of getting money this way. Or in other words, they send an agent to hire a middleman to make the call, and if the middleman's ever caught, then he doesn't even know how to report to the police the people who got him to do it. If they are this expansive, then it would be global, and it would have to be an incredibly large organization.
You say that. I don't know how bad scam calls are in other countries, but like in America, it's horrible. It's just plumb horrible.
And people have made the relatively fair point of if gangs and things like the mafia were such a huge deal for hundreds of years and then they just kind of disappeared, who's to say they didn't go into things like cyber or electronic theft? I also want to mention there's been a number of journalists and police officers who have investigated this, who have been found not alive. So to cover my bases on this, these are all jokes. Everything saying
to cover this, these are all jokes. I'm just joking. I don't believe any of it.
It's a joke. This YouTube channel is a joke. I'm a joke. Nothing that I'm saying.
I agree with him right now. Same with me.
And this is to my audience. If for whatever reason in the future news comes out that I committed exit game, no, I didn't. Approaching stars is the opposite of the expanding universe theory. So you know the idea that there's a Big Bang or some event.
I get how this is going to be.
The universe, and because of that, everything's kind of drifting.
But in reality, now it's
unified center. Well, this idea is saying that perhaps that center developed its own gravitational pull and became a really big black hole, because now everything is coming back to where it started. Because of this, things like stars and meteorites and everything else is slowly getting confined to a much smaller space, which means before we're wiped out by our sun getting big and exploding, we'll probably get hit by a meteor or run into another solar system. So don't worry about it. Love Shack is an operating system that supposedly contains the grand truth of the universe. Now, I'm an idiot when it comes to reading things like computer operating systems, but from the best that I can make out, the idea is within the code of the Love Shack operating system is this grand truth, or essentially the one middle concept that all forms of human expression and science can be defined by. So supposedly, if you were to go within the operating system and enter something like a chemical equation, it will then convert that into calculus, it will convert that into forms of poetry, it can convert that into spiritualism and whatever. Essentially, this is supposedly a super duper top secret OS that allows people to discover the hidden truths within the universe because of its own hidden secret code. Retrocausality is something that I've mentioned before in the past, but it's going to get more attention here. The main idea being that things like cause and effect do not operate the way that we think it does. Instead, things simply happen and the universe corrects itself as a means of maintaining that end goal. It essentially comes down to the idea that there isn't really that much agency when it comes to what happens in the future. It's all predetermined. Instead, things happen and therefore people align to it. And the reason it gives for this is the idea that time itself exists as a dimension. And you've probably heard that before, but what it really means is that time is just our way of observing the universe. However, it's something that can be manipulated and we could definitely change. We just don't know how to yet. So while we view everything that happens to us as being on a straight track, in reality, things just kind of happen and there's not really a timeline to it. This has also been used as a means of explaining the Mandela effect. For example, things like the Monopoly Man. Most people, when they think of a Monopoly Man, think of him as having a monocle, even though he never did. So the idea is that we saw him at one point with a monocle. That's our memory of him. However, at some point in the future, he did not have a monocle, and for whatever reason, the timeline just favored that one and corrected itself. So now every iteration of him does not have the monocle. So whenever you apply that to larger scale things like human civilizations, wars, kingships, and what have you, you can theoretically get to a point, if someone were to understand this and to understand how retrocausality works, where there would be no unknown future. Or in other words, if things in our future are going to take place, and if time is just a construct that we've built for ourselves, then there should be ways to determine what is about to happen to us, because in terms of retrocausality, it's already happened. And not only things like predicting the future, but it can get to things like time travel, things like dimensional travel, and all that other cool stuff. Vaccine soul stealing is, let me clarify, because YouTube really likes to demonetize people who say the V word, especially in a video that has conspiracy theory in the title. As you're going to find out, it has nothing to do with modern political climates or modern political issues. As a matter of fact, this chart was made like 5 years ago, so again, nothing to do with that. And it isn't even saying something about all vaccines being bad, just one specific theory. I'm begging you, Susan, please do not take my money. Essentially, the idea is that in the early 2000s, the CIA got really interested in the concept of gene editing. Now, this is something from the MK Ultra experiments and other theories that I've mentioned on this iceberg that the CIA is definitely not opposed to doing. However, in this case, the CIA was interested in something known as the fundamentalist gene. The idea behind the fundamentalist gene is that it's a gene or actual section of the human brain that allows people to have a belief or calling to a higher power. In other words, there's parts of the brain that light up more with people who believe in things like religion and God as opposed to people who do not. So during the war in the Middle East, the CIA wanted to know if there was a way to sort of chemically castrate this. And supposedly, as the theory states, the CIA developed these vaccines that they handed out overseas in populations that they think may fall in line to a radicalization that is not in their favor. Or in other words, the CIA gave out medication to people that, unbeknownst to them, would cause them to lose their ability or focus on God and things relating to a higher power as a means of making sure that they didn't fear any higher authority than the United States government. But I mean, I think at this point, you know, we can all agree that this is stupid and didn't happen. Like, come on, guys, we know the reason that the United States was in the Middle East was to get the zombie plague back from the Russian scientists. Like, it's really not that hard. Hello, everybody, and welcome.
Oh, Lord, tier 0. I like that it goes from 9 to 0, but yeah, oof. Man, I was trying so hard to get through that. I'm like so tired. It's like, what time is it? It's almost 4 o'clock in the morning. So, yeah, I'm pretty tired. Yeah, It was really cool. I was really surprised I had a couple things in there that I actually knew, which was really weird because I had gone through such a dry spell of not knowing anything. But yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll catch you guys later. Bye.